And the story basically goes, you walk up to three people, they're laying bricks. You ask the first person, what's your job? They say, well, I take the bricks from this pile, put them over here. You ask the second person, what's your job? And they tell you, well, I put the cement on top of the bricks over there. And then you go and ask the third person, what's your job? And they say, we're building a cathedral. And the basic idea behind this, for product people, and leaders, it's a pithy little reminder that your team needs to understand the cathedral that they're actually building, because nobody wants to lay bricks all day in service of nothing. And, for me, it was told to me by Shashir in a one-on-one where I was kind of bemoaning the fact that my team wasn't reaching their full potential. And he asked me this question of, well, do they have a clear cathedral? And at the time, I didn't have any idea what he was talking about. And then he explained the story and it sort of immediately clicked for me.
My guest today is Lane Shackleton, Chief Product Officer at Coda. Lane has built some amazing product rituals that you can follow to craft a great product vision, host effective product reviews, make decisions without meetings, and ship faster. I especially love his two-way write-ups and catalyst meeting rituals that you can put into practice right now. If you enjoy our conversation, please like and subscribe to support this podcast. All right, Lane. Well, thanks so much for joining me. Great to have you here. Do you guys have a ritual at Coda for crafting a vision for a product or for a company?
Yeah, I think there are a few different ways to do this that have worked for us over the years, and there are probably two that I keep coming back to. The first is adopting kind of an Amazon-style approach where you work backwards from an end customer experience that you're trying to create. I'm generally a huge fan of the process of writing a press release as a way to anchor to the value that you're going to drive for customers. I think it really forces you to speak clearly to what the customers are going to get out of what you're doing from the very start of the product development process. And sort of one thing I like about the working backwards process in general is that it kind of works at all levels. Like it could be a feature, it could be a big launch that is, a bunch of different things, or it could be as big as like a company vision that you're working backwards from. So it's sort of a one process that tends to work well at all layers, which I like. So that's one. The second one is to do an exercise with your team. So, if you have some doubts whether your team is kind of rowing the same direction, I think it's helpful to have some starting point into that discussion. So you can run an exercise to see if you're kind of picturing the same vision, and then use that as kind of a jumping off point to create kind of a clearer picture for the team. So you might start with a big question like, what's different in the world when we're done with our work, or, what change are we responsible for driving in the world? And I think big questions like that tend to unhook a team from their current work streams and kind of like smaller day-to-day thinking, and help them climb up the ladder of abstraction and see the forest a bit. And you can do both these processes as like a part of a planning process, or maybe at an offsite, times when you're getting the team together to reflect. So I think those are two rituals that we have for crafting product vision that I think have, kind of stood the test of a lot of planning cycles.
That's awesome. Yeah. So I worked at probably too many companies, and a lot of times the vision is just like this one-line statement, this like pithy statement, usually pretty broad. But I actually really like the vision artifact. You have a whole Figma around this. Yeah. So we can just kind of describe that a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, in general, I'm a really big believer in creating clear artifacts at the end of these processes. I think way too often people leave these types of exercises and they're energized, and then a week later, nothing is different. And everything kind of fades into the background, or they leave with some generic vision statement that no one really believes in or can effectively, tie their identity to. So you kind of have to create a clear picture of what that, future might look like, right? And I've definitely made the mistake plenty of times in my career of painting just one part of that picture, only to realize later that, a key member of that team needed something different to like really grok it or understand it or get on board. And so, some people need the metric, and some people need the directional mock of how it's going to look to customers, and some people need the strategy paragraph that kind of like summarizes what the thesis is. So I wrote a post about this and sort of talked about a particular moment in Coda's history where we were making a pretty significant change in terms of kind of our medium-term vision. And as a part of that, Shashir and I tried to learn from all the past mistakes in planning. And so we created this kind of really comprehensive planning artifact with a small group of people. And this particular artifact included, what a product marketing sort of page might look like, example product improvements, what a billboard would look like, what our target customer was in this particular case, all the different types of content that we might create as in service of this kind of shift in vision or strategy. And that served, I think, as an anchor for people and gave them kind of a clearer picture of what we meant, right? And it ended up being kind of one of the most smooth planning processes we had, despite it being like a pretty large change. So I think in general, my advice in this topic is essentially don't let yourself leave these nice, important planning or vision moments without something that you can put on the wall, something that you can present at an all hands, something that the team can like regularly come back to.
Yeah, because like if you make like, billboard ads or like the stuff that you have in the Figma, like you can literally just print it out and put it on the office walls, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And we did. Yeah.
Was it like a pretty small group of people, like a couple of designers, or like who did you work with to put this together?
Yeah, at the time it was basically the head of brand, who was also an amazing writer. It was one of our more senior designers. It was a couple of the folks from the core product team, and then someone from the marketing team as well.
Yeah, I think the visual stuff really brings it to life. Like even, at Roblox and other companies, like having a North Star experience is like so much better than just like a one-line statement or like a couple of paragraphs. Like people don't like to read my paragraphs, Got it. So now that, you have this artifact, which I think is amazing, like what kind of ritual do you have to translate this vision into like what to build next or like a roadmap?
Yeah, I think we generally have kind of like a strategy or annual planning nowadays, annual planning memo. And this has changed in terms of its cadence over the years. It used to be in the early days, it was like every 3 months we were kind of reviewing this type of stuff. And then as the team got larger, and as the vision got a little bit more cemented, we could do it less frequently. In terms of translating that, it starts often with kind of a strategy memo or a vision memo. And that is, try to limit that to like 1 or 2 pages. Leading up to that, there's a process that starts by identifying what are the key challenges of the business. And often nowadays, our data research and insights team comes up with all of the kind of most recent and interesting insights as a feeder to that process. And so from that, we can kind of extract, okay, here are the big challenges that are facing the business. And then we can basically map the most important of those challenges. So that might be a list of 20 things, right? And then we whittle it down to a small set, 2, 3, 4. And then we try to map those key challenges onto what are the big bets for the year. And that way there's kind of a direct linkage between the challenge that's facing the business and a big effort that is going to drive change in that area. And so once you have kind of like those key challenges and then the big bets, teams can go off and plan, quarterly OKRs and can give a bit of a look ahead, what we call quarterly plus OKRs.
Got it. And like, what is a quarterly plus OKR? What does plus mean?
Yeah, it's not sort of a fancy term for a simple concept. So it starts in this idea that, it's difficult to do medium-term planning in environments where everything's changing. Your customers are changing, what you're delivering is changing. In this world of AI, technology is changing incredibly fast. So, you try not to forecast further ahead than you need to. And so, when we were writing quarterly OKRs, it felt like, oh, quarterly OKRs are great, but like what happens, on the 6-month time horizon? And then if you're doing 1H and 2H planning, it felt like we were asking teams to be too precise with what's going to happen 5-6 months from now, which was just unrealistic, right? And so the idea behind Quarterly Plus is you commit to what you're doing this quarter. So that's the quarter part. And then the plus part is effectively take us ahead a quarter and just give us an idea of what's coming up. So if you're in Q1 planning, you commit to your Q1 OKRs, and then you say, look, these are the big milestones or decisions or risks or other things that we foresee coming up in Q2. we may not have all the answers right now, but we want to give you an early heads up that these points in time are coming, or these decisions are coming, or these risks are there. And that way the team can kind of feel like they can evolve as they learn, right? Instead of trying to set everything out 6 months at a time.
Yeah, I think like having like a annual roadmap for every quarter down to like what features will ship like 3 quarters from now is kind of like a myth.
Totally
You're like in
unrealistic.
the press or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of evaluate when this stuff changes halfway through? Like I don't know if Coda AI was like something that kind of came halfway through, or you kind of planned for it already in January. But like, how do you evaluate when the market changes?
Yeah, Code AI really came up in Q4 of last year, spurred by some internal teams who are starting to build some really interesting prototypes. And then one of our investors, Reid Hoffman, is very, obviously very involved with AI from the beginning. In terms of the question of like, how do we change these? I mean, it's a tricky question. It always depends on the situation. As an aside, the longer I do product work, the more my answer is like, it depends, or it's complicated. So it's a cop out of an answer, but worth giving that caveat. I mean, the kind of shorter or more direct answer would be, we try to let teams make that determination as much as possible. So if they're working on delivering something, some OKR, and they feel like the customer need has changed, or they have a higher value item that they should work on, like they have full agency to say, hey, we canceled that OKR and we wrote ourselves a new OKR even within the quarter. And that does happen. And then I think the other, that's some mix of like the OKR itself and the strategic principle, or like what changed in the strategy to change that OKR. So it's a little bit hard to decouple those two things. I think, the way that we tend to do strategy over the longer arc is we're trying to evaluate, is a given strategy working? And that tends to span 2, 3, 4, 5 quarters, right? One example is we're trying to make the product more approachable. That is a multi-year endeavor. And so by necessity, we're making adjustments within quarters about what the highest value thing might be. And that may surface as OKRs, but we still need to evaluate kind of the longer strategy arc.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment. So like, I'll give you an example from Roblox. It has a pretty interesting culture where like, if you're working on like a bet, then you're not really on the hook to move some number by 2% every quarter. Like the example that I got was like, it's better to like not move the number at all for 3 quarters, and then 10x the number in Q4, then you need to move it by 2% every quarter.
Totally.
So that's pretty interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I mean, I think in general, like if you're going to hire really smart people, you have to trust their intuition. You know what I mean? And so too much management of the how in that sense can often get in the way of some really clever solutions to problems. So
yeah. So let's talk about like product reviews, which like, product people spend a lot of time on. Like, you've been at Google for 7 years before Coda. Like, what are some drawbacks that people, like traps that people fall into for product reviews?
Yeah, there are a lot of these. And I think in general, people don't pay enough attention to how the work gets reviewed, because I think oftentimes that it highly correlated with the output itself. I think some of the pitfalls in general, oftentimes you just start with the wrong people. So the number of times that I've been in product reviews where someone says, do we have this person? Shouldn't they be here? Is probably too many times to count. The other one that is debilitating for velocity of a product team is it just takes too long to schedule. So this happened a lot at Google and YouTube, where you'd have a review and it was a month out, and you'd start preparing for the review. And then by the time that you actually got to the review, the thing that you were wanting to talk about had like either shipped, or you could have made 2x, 3x faster progress if you just had the review that week. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which is insane, but like it's the reality of busy people with busy calendars. I think the other one is review meetings starting without a similar or shared set of context. So oftentimes you'll start a review meeting, someone will dive right into a deep topic, and no one who's deep on that topic wants to go through 10 slides about the background, right? Like they want to get into the discussion, but you have 3 or 4 people in that room that really need that context in order to give input, which you're asking them to do. So starting with kind of like shared context I think is essential. And it tends to be easier to do, in my opinion, in a written doc form, because you can just, write some background or context and collapse it and people already know that, they can just not read it. And then I think the other one that's kind of classic is getting a meeting kind of co-opted by the highest paid person in the room, the loudest person in the room. I definitely saw this all the time at Google and YouTube. It's a very common pattern. So yeah, we've spent a bunch of time thinking about how to work around these issues.
Yeah, like, I've had a lot of product reviews too, and like a lot of times it's like, there's like 10 execs in the room with the CEO, and most of the time it's just the CEO providing feedback. And like you gotta, like, sometimes you gotta do some pre-work. You gotta make sure, like, you use the management chain to talk to the CEO beforehand, make sure he has the right context. And there's like a lot of like time wasted doing this stuff. So I actually think like, Coda has a really amazing process. So maybe like it starts with just like the schedule, right? Like making these people available. So maybe we can talk about the Catalyst schedule that you guys have.
Yeah. I think so. The idea behind Catalyst was really born out of trying to solve those problems very directly, very tactically. Okay. So first, it's a frequent and pre-scheduled block of time on everybody's calendar. So I have 3 hours per week on my calendar that are blocked for Catalyst slots. And that means and that's everybody in the company, right? That's not just me or Shashir or other people. So what that means is that you can always get the right person in the room, right? Like sort of by default, you should have no excuse to wait a month for a review, because there are going to be times where you can get people there. And in practice, this is perhaps one of the biggest pieces of Catalyst, just that you can get the meeting scheduled and get the right people in the room. So the other part of Catalyst scheduling is that there are kind of 3 main roles. There's the driver, the person who's like kind of responsible for driving either the meeting or the decision. There's the brain trust. That's sort of modeled after Pixar's brain trust concept. And then there's people that are interested. And so this schedule is open to the entire company. And so anyone can go in and say, like, I'm interested in this topic. This may affect my job. I want to be involved, and click an interested button, and they'll get added automatically to the calendar. And so what ends up happening is the night before, so say it's a Catalyst slot on Tuesday, the hold will be removed and I'll get scheduled for the specific Catalyst topics that are relevant to me, where I've been added as like the driver, the maker, the brain trust. And that way I have exactly what I need on my schedule. Usually they're very, well run, because docs are sent ahead of time as pre-reads, and they're almost always run out of a written doc where I can go in, read the doc, get all the context, and then the kind of process generally is to add both questions and kind of a written feeling about like what you feel about the proposal. And teams will use lots of different kind of clever ways to get reactions from people. They might have something that says like, I'm aligned on this topic, I'm not aligned, I have questions. Like there's a lot of different patterns that people use within a Catalyst. But I think the key part is that you can always get the right people in the room.
So the doc is sent out maybe like a day before or like a couple of days before?
It's either sent out the day before, or we take the first 15 minutes of a meeting. It's sort of both patterns. It really depends on the person.
And like, I really like this concept of two-way docs, because I find that a lot of the discussion can actually happen in the doc itself. So like, but you have this thing called a pulse check, and you also have Dory. Talk about those two things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is again born out of the kind of negative experience of many times at Google and YouTube sending out a doc as a pre-read and then trying to figure out like who's actually read the doc, waiting for an SVP or like a leader's avatar to show up in the doc and to figure out if they'd actually read it. And then, ultimately having these like long comment threads, and that were like really substantive stuff. Like, we should cancel this effort. Someone make a comment on the title of your doc that says that. And then like 3 lines later, someone's talking about, the fact that you have a grammar mistake. Like those two things are totally, opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of feedback, but they're sort of in the same modality. So the idea behind what we call Dory, which is named after the fish in Finding Nemo that asks all the questions, is you should be able to get out your kind of like top level questions. And then we should actually vote on those questions. Like we should get a pulse from the group on what is on people's minds. And so basically the table sorts itself by the votes. And so the top rated questions go to the top. And then often the discussion will be driven from that question table. And then the other aspect is, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but you have these comments that often are either in like the title of the doc in like a Google Doc, or they're like on the last paragraph, and it's the meta thought or like how I feel about the overall decision or the overall proposal or something like that. And so we try to pull out the kind of like meta or overall summary of someone's feeling or sentiment on a proposal into its own table. And that way we can kind of get an overall check. Like, okay, I know that you have these 3 issues, or I know that you have these 3 questions, but like, do you feel good about us moving forward with this, or give us your specific take? And this has helped in so many different ways over the years, and it's so ingrained in our culture. And, first and foremost, it helps people really understand what the room is thinking and feeling, and so that they don't have to go do the like 20 one-on-ones and get everybody's individual sentiment, right? It's such a waste of time. And so personally, I'll give you like one example. I had a proposal that I thought was like totally uncontroversial. And so I kind of rolled out this proposal in a Catalyst, and I got 4 and 5 stars out of, kind of out of a five smiley face scale from everybody. And then like one of our most senior designers gave it a 1 and basically said like, I think this is all wrong. We shouldn't do this. And like this person's actually quite, is a quiet kind of personality. And so if you had a typical review cycle where you had a bunch of loud people in that room discussing it, like their voice would have gotten drowned out for sure. But I wouldn't have known that they were so against this proposal unless we had something like a pulse table. So there are just many instances where you kind of get how people really feel about something.
Yeah, but I think that also requires a culture where people are open to voicing their opinion, right? Because like, if the designers like disagreeing with you or should share, then you feel comfortable doing that.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, without a doubt, you have to have a culture that is like a safe space. Yeah.
Do you think I think this is overall great. Do you think there's still some challenges? Like, for example, if share gives like a 5-star or like, puts a comment there, is there like, do people just follow along and be like, hey, share, you're right? Or people actually call him out?
I think people will add their feedback way before he's obviously a busy person. And so he's often giving his feedback in, right at the start of the meeting or something like that. And so people will have added their feedback already in many of those cases. And he's the type of person that takes input and wants to know everybody's real views and opinions. And so I don't think people feel bad about disagreeing with him. I think he also often brings a different level of context into decisions just because he's talking to investors, he's talking to other executives, he's talking to other companies, he's, on the board of Spotify. So he brings a lot of context that I think sometimes people might not have. But in general, I think it's part of his personality to want to know if someone disagrees.
I think just to wrap this part up, like when should a PM like actually have a product review through this process? And like, do you think some of the more like controversial decisions like have more disagreement or like have more discussion?
Yeah, I think, it's probably more art than science of when to do these. I tend to be a big fan of trying to get teams to gather input as early as possible. So we do something that we call brain trust kickoffs, where we basically say, okay, gather the people that you think are going to be integral to this effort. And then the kind of failure mode, to draw some contrast for a second, the failure mode is you learn late in the process that Shashir feels really strongly about XYZ, or you learn late in the process that some customer has a big issue with the direction that you're headed, right? And so what you're trying to do in something like a brain trust kickoff is get all the context out there from the very beginning. So like as a PM, I want to know your worries. I want to know what you think success looks like. I want to know all of that like on day one of this effort. So in general, like I think there's a failure mode of product reviews, which is that it happens at the end of the process, right? And so like, I think what we try to do is try to go to the other side of the spectrum and say like, it's not a review per se, but it is a kickoff of sorts where you can kind of start to gather that input that you think can help you accelerate your effort instead of, you know, having to feel like you're just going through a pure review cycle. And that way, that when you go into later reviews, you know, oh, you know, Shashir or Lane or Oliver, someone feels strongly about this particular concept. So we need to address that. You know, we need to make sure that their concern is heard. So that's one facet of it, which flips the idea of like a review in general. And then I think the other thing to say is, you know, oftentimes it's like a conversation. Is this going to impact a lot of customers? Is it going to impact a lot of internal teams? Okay, it's probably worth going to Catalyst, right? Is this going to be a reversible decision or an irreversible decision? Okay, if it's irreversible or if we feel like it's a one-way door, then like we should be more deliberate about it, right? And so bring that to Catalyst. So it's a conversation like that usually.
Yeah, I love the point about getting the feedback as early as possible, maybe just like with the proposal stage, because you don't want to like build a product and have strong feedback afterwards. Yeah.
The worst feeling in the world, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I love how you guys run all these processes through Coda itself. And like another principle you have is just like, you know, learn by making, not talking. And at larger companies, you can have like how it works, right? Like you have a product review with like the CEO and there's like people literally spend like 2 months preparing for it, going through like VP and then going up. Like, how do you guys, I guess Coda is still small, but how do you guys like help the PMs and the team stay focused on just like shipping stuff to the customer versus like a bunch of internal optics stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I think a few things to say here. One is I think I'm a big believer, and I think Shashir is a big believer, and the rest of our executive team is big believers in kind of like as much as possible decentralized leadership. And what that means is people should have the leads that we entrust to lead these teams should have the autonomy to make the bulk of these decisions themselves. And I think that in practice, that is quite true. And then there are certain things that span teams or span, you know, the company or customers that often need kind of like a broader set of people to take a look at. And so I think the default when we're talking about smaller or less consequential to the company decisions or features, et cetera, the default should just be like those things ship, right? And like there's an internal feedback process and you can like get on that train and you can like give your feedback and the teams will take that input and like iterate with it. And so that's part of the culture. And then I think the other thing to say is it's a culture of makers, right? And so like the default orientation is like, okay, I hear what you're saying. Can you show me what that looks like? Or like, do you have a prototype of that? Or can you like somehow make this experience feel real versus like, yeah, we can talk in circles about how great this could be. One example, kind of tactical example of that I think created a real multiplier effect was something that we call ad hoc environments. So the basic idea was especially when we were building like the formula language and tables and stuff like that, it was really hard to mock out all the scenarios, right? You would like end up with these mocks that were like 100 Figma frames long because you're trying to like detail every interaction of like when the cursor moves in the formula builder. Yeah. And so one of the engineers, the lead engineers at the time, this guy named Chris, basically said like, look, I'm going to make it so that any engineer can take a branch of code and get that branch running with a full environment behind it. So a full database, you know, full calculation engine, full front end, everything. And so what that did, and it's like sort of in its own separate environment, it's not going to bring down production, it's not going to affect customers, but one important key is it was accessible, and we still use this, it is accessible to customers. And so what that means is like, if you're a PM or designer or engineer, you're kind of like a pod working together and you have some idea, you can actually get it up on a fully functional environment and put it in front of customers in a way that is not going to affect the rest of customers, and in a way that is like pretty much as easy as writing some very prototypey, crappy code to do the thing that you meant, and then showing that to someone, right? And so that was like an example where it went from, okay, we can't really feel how what it's like to deal with the formula builder with this change on typing or this change on colors or whatever it is. And once you had that, you could say like, just make the change, push it up to an ad hoc environment, and then I'll play with it. And then like now we're in the cycle of like building and making and iterating, right?
Yeah.
And so lots of other examples, but that's like one tactical example of how that principle became real.
Yeah, I love that. Like you don't realize how if the product feels until you actually play with it.
Totally.
A lot of times. And yeah, getting into the customer hands is very possible. It is also like I guess if you come to a product review with actual customer feedback, that always goes better than just like
totally
a bunch of assumption, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, if you're in a company that is like product oriented, I think the leadership team often respects that so much more, right? And they're like, oh, wow, you've already learned that, customers like this aspect and don't like this aspect in that first review. That's like way higher fidelity data than you wrote what the experience could be. You know what I mean? And
yeah.
They're like, and a leadership team that is a bunch of builders is going to get really excited by that.
Yeah, that's kind of my hack. Like I always try to get some customer feedback.
Yeah.
And, customer feedback is one thing that can potentially, if you disagree with the CEO, can actually support your case.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah,
Exactly.
Awesome. Where can people learn more about, where can people learn more about you, but also like all these great rituals and like frameworks, I think is actually available on Coda, right? So like where can people find that?
So there's probably two places. One is the Coda Gallery. We publish a lot of these templates and rituals to the Coda Gallery. That's coda.io/gallery. And then I've been writing about rituals more recently, especially rituals for product teams. And that's just lane.substack.com. And then Shashir is also writing kind of a broader book on rituals of great teams. And this was spurred by something that we started during the pandemic, which was having a bunch of dinners. It started over Zoom, now it's in person, with leaders of all types of different teams, and just hearing about their rituals and how they run their teams. And so he's writing a book called Rituals of Great Teams. You can just Google that. And there's kind of a brain trust for that. You can actually read kind of an early copy of it. But those are probably the three places that we talk a lot about these concepts.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much, Dave, for sharing this information publicly. Like it can definitely like help other product teams, including mine. So thanks.
Awesome. Yeah. Hope it was helpful. Thank you.